At a high-level overview, what we have is we're going to talk about the breaking points within a source and a sink connector. Then we're going to talk about some converter configurations, how to handle transformations, and then some schema compatibility. So we start off with a Kafka Connect worker. We have a source connector. Within the source connector, you may end up with something like a connect exception, right? And in those cases, normally what you have to do is apply a configuration change. Maybe your username or your password to the database that you're connecting to was not properly set. Afterwards, it goes to a transformation. And within the transformation, you may end up with something like a data exception. Well, since it's a source connectors do not have dead letter queue, so they cannot route that message to another topic. In that case, you have to modify the transformation. Then you have a converter, and within a converter, you may end up with a serialization exception, and again, you would have to modify the configuration. Serialization exceptions within a source connector should be rather very uncommon, just because of the fact that if you cannot pull the data and produce it to the topic, there might, more than likely, there's something going on with the source connector itself. And then there's producer. The producer can throw a number of exceptions. In this particular example, we're just going to go with schema compatibility. And in that case, you can modify the compatibility for the schema registry. Next, it's a sink connector. So for a sink connector, you start off with a consumer. Within a consumer, you may get something like a commit exception. It could be a number of exceptions that could be thrown. In that case, again, you would have to maybe modify how long you wait before you throw the commit exception. Maybe you want to wait a little bit longer. Then you have a converter. Within a converter, you may get a serialization exception. For sink connectors, you can actually use a dead letter queue in this case. So you can actually route that bad message to another topic and later process it. Same thing for transformations. Within the transformations, you may end up with a data exception. And then at that case, you can use a dead letter queue again. And then when you actually reach the sink connector itself, where it actually sends the data to the other endpoint, like a MySQL database, you may end up with a connection exception. And again, you have to do some sort of configuration change when it comes to the configurations being used by the sink connector. So that's just like a very high-level overview of some of the breaking points here. Now let's talk about converter configurations. This is one that I've actually heard from people. It's like, there's something wrong with your converter. I keep getting the default value. So this configuration is called ignore default for nullables. The actual definition to me is a little bit more confusing. So what I tend to do is I actually, in my mind, I think of it, and when I read it as ignore default when nullable. That's how I tend to read it. And by default, this configuration is set to false. So let's go through an example, and it'll be a lot easier to understand. So here's a database table. I have an ID, a first name, and a last name. Notice in my first name, it's null. There's no data for Joe, for Doe, and Manchester. I have a schema that's registered against my topic. And specifically, I have a first name that can have a string or a null. Now notice that within my schema, the default value for this is John. I have my database table that has my first name as null, but for whatever reason, I keep getting my data being produced with the default value of John. This is because of this configuration. Again, the way I read it is ignore default when nullables. Is there a null? Yes. Do you want to ignore the default? False. I don't want to ignore the default, so I'm going to use the default. If I set this configuration to true, I'll actually get my data to be produced as a null value within my topic. And this particular configuration applies to your Avro, protobuf, and JSON schema converter. Then there's replace null with default. This is actually a configuration does pretty much the exact same thing. It's just that this gets applied at a JSON converter. So in this case, the default value is true. We still have the same table. And then whenever we have it with the true default value, we end up actually using the default value. So replace null with default. Yes, I do want to replace it, so it's going to use John. If I set this configuration to null, to false, it will actually go ahead and produce my data as null. And again, this particular converter configuration is for the JSON converter specifically. Then there's scrub invalid names. So what do I mean by scrub invalid names? Well, you can name a field in a particular manner, and then the converter will not like it. So what are the actual invalid names that it checks for? Well, any field name that begins with a number, that's considered an invalid field. Then any field name that starts with an underscore, that's also an invalid field. And then if you have within the field name a invalid character. Well, what's an invalid character? Anything outside of a letter, digit, an underscore, and a dash, they're considered invalid characters. So if you put a pound symbol, like invalid pound characters, that's going to end up throwing you an error at the converter level. As I mentioned, also this particular configuration is actually set to the, false by default. So here's a quick little example. The configuration is set to false. My field name is 123 invalid name. And whenever I do this and I try to produce a record, I end up getting this particular exception within my connect logs. Illegal initial character 123 invalid name. So whenever you set this configuration to true, I still keep the same field name. However, whenever I produce the actual data to the topic, what ends up happening is it appends an X at the beginning of the field name. And this particular configuration gets applied for Avro and protobuf converters. Then there's connect.meta.data. This just adds some metadata to your schema, and I've heard this a few times where people just don't want to have that metadata. This default configuration is set to true. So here's like a little example of what the metadata looks like. So you have like connect.name, connect.parameters, and connect.version. If you set this configuration false, simply just removes all the metadata from your schema. And here's a quick side-by-side comparison between the false configuration versus true configuration. And this is specifically for the Avro converter. Normally, you do want to have that configuration set to true, especially when you're using it for sync connector as well, because you want to have that metadata to have that high precision and that information for the converter. One more thing. If you actually want to use these configurations, don't forget you actually need to make sure that you have the prefix. If you don't have value.converter or key.converter as a prefix to any of these configurations, they're not going to get applied. Next, we're going to talk about transformations. So there's a large number of open source SMTs. I could go through every single one of them, but going through every single one of them, I don't actually have enough time for that. And also, you can just look up the documentation, and there's plenty of examples for every single one of them. So let's just walk through one of them. Here's a simple cast. I'm just changing the ID to be a string and the name to be a float. My ID is 101, so I can change a number to a string quite easily. However, my name is another. The problem with that is you cannot actually change the name another to a float. So what ends up happening, you end up getting an exception. Value was out of range for the requested data type. In that case, depending on what kind of connector you have, you can either make a configuration change or a dead letter Q if it's a sync connector. This general idea applies to all of the transformations. So any transformation can be debugged in this manner. So rather than going through every single one of them, I'd rather draw your attention to something else that I hear from a lot of the forums online. And that is, all I want is nested data. So here's an example of nested data. We have a name, email, city, state, country, last modified. And what I hear is people want to, for example, maybe create the city, state, and the country to be nested, to actually have the parent as the address. So this is a quick example. This is what a lot of people want, is they want it to actually be address as the parent, and then inside you're going to have country, city, and state. There's only one problem. Right now, you can't really do that with all the available SMTs that are currently open source. So what I ended up doing, I just ended up building a custom SMT. If anybody wants to contribute, feel free to contribute to it. However, it simply just does a recursive nesting of the data based off of the delimiter. So we're going to walk through a quick example. So I start off with a SMT for replace field name, where what I'm doing is for my database, instead of taking the field city, it's going to be renamed to address underscore city. And then for state, it's going to be address underscore state. Country is going to be address underscore state. Afterwards, I also made sure I defined my custom SMT with a delimiter in there. And this is what actually allows you to get the data from the left-hand side to be produced with the data on the right-hand side, where you actually have the nested structure. And this SMT actually will work recursively, so it'll go as many layers as you want down the tree. So for example, in this, I have a city that was renamed to address_city_county. And as you can tell on the right-hand side, instead of having city and having Austin, now it's city and then county and then Austin. There's a catch when it comes to using this transformation, and that is schema compatibility. What do I mean by that? Well, if you already registered the schema that's on the left-hand side, and then you try to register the schema on the right-hand side, where you actually have the city and the county now, there's going to be a compatibility issue. And that leads me to my next section, which is schema compatibility. So let's just go through a quick high-level overview of schema compatibilities, which ones are available. So we have backwards. Backwards, you can delete the field type, add an optional field, and it checks against the latest schema before registering it, and you should upgrade the consumer first. Forward, you can add a field and delete optional fields, and normally you upgrade the producer first. And then there's full, where you can add optional fields and delete optional fields, and it doesn't matter which order you upgrade the client. And then there's 3 more. They're essentially the same if you were to remove the transitive. The main difference is that it checks against all previous schemas. So the changes allowed are the same. It's just that it checks against all previous schemas before moving forward. And then, of course, there's none, where you disable compatibility. So now that we went over like a really high-level overview, why is this incompatible? So let's think about this for a second. On the left-hand side, we have address, country, city, and state. On the right-hand side, we still have those fields, but city now also has county. So we need to look at the schema. What we should notice over here, that on the right-hand side, within the city field, what we're actually doing here is we had city previously registered for this topic for the schema, but we're simply adding a new field. We're modifying city, so now we have another field, which is county. And that's a problem here. You are modifying an existing field from a previous schema that was registered. City was there, now you're trying to add county to city, and that's not adding a brand new field, you're adding a new field to something that already existed. And because of this, the only way to get around something like this is simply you have to make sure that you set your compatibility to none. That's all I got. Thank you for your time.